At our son's lavish housewarming party, my wife grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, her fingers digging into my suit jacket. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper above the clinking champagne glasses. "We need to leave right now." I looked at her confused. "Why? What is going on?" She stayed silent, her eyes darting toward the hallway. She didn't speak another word until we were locked inside our car. Finally, she turned to me, her face pale, and asked, "You didn't actually see the final paperwork, did you?" What she told me next left me completely frozen. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I am exactly 70 years old today, and I spent the last 4 decades of my life building Caldwell Logistics from a single delivery truck into a nationwide operation. My wife, Catherine, and I worked tirelessly to give our only son, David, the kind of life we could only dream of when we were young. We paid for his college, we paid for his lavish wedding to Monica, and just last month, I wired $1.2 million in cash. It was the down payment for a stunning $2.5 million estate in the upscale suburbs of Illinois. It was supposed to be their forever home, a safe place to raise our future grandchildren. That was the dream, or so I thought. Tonight was the grand housewarming party. The long, winding concrete driveway was completely packed with expensive luxury cars. The caterers were passing around expensive appetizers. But something felt incredibly wrong the moment Catherine and I walked through the front doors. David and Monica were barely hosting. Instead, Monica's mother, Beatrice, was holding court in the grand foyer. Beatrice was a woman who always acted like she owned the world despite having zero accomplishments to her name. She was parading around the living room, directing the staff and pointing out the custom renovations as if she had paid for every single brick. I tried to ignore it. I told myself she was just an overbearing mother enjoying her daughter's success. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water and stood near the kitchen watching my son. David looked nervous. He kept adjusting his tie, avoiding my gaze whenever I looked in his direction. Whenever I tried to approach him to ask how the move went, Monica would conveniently appear and pull him away to greet another guest. The atmosphere was suffocating. I felt like a stranger in a house my own money had secured. That was when Catherine grabbed my arm. Her face was ashen. My wife is a strong, composed woman. She handled the stressful years of building our business with unwavering grace. Seeing her this terrified sent a chill straight down my spine. I followed her out the front door, leaving the noise of the party behind us. The cool night air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm my racing heart. We practically jogged down the long, winding driveway to where I had parked my sedan. I unlocked the doors and we both got in. Catherine locked the doors immediately. She was breathing heavily, clutching her purse to her chest. I put my hands on the steering wheel and looked at her. "Catherine, talk to me. What is happening? Did Beatrice say something to you?" I asked, my frustration beginning to build. She shook her head slowly, trying to catch her breath. "Richard, the house. You told me you wired the money to David's escrow account. You told me this house was for our son." "It is for our son," I replied, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I handled the transfer myself. The real estate attorney sent over the preliminary agreements last month. Everything was in David and Monica's names. "What is the problem?" Catherine closed her eyes and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "I needed to use the restroom. The one on the main floor was occupied, so I went upstairs. I walked past the master suite and saw the door to the private study was wide open. Beatrice was in there." She paused, swallowing hard. "Richard, she was not just in there. She was standing by the desk holding a glass of wine, showing off something on the wall to 3 of her friends. They were laughing. They were laughing at us. I felt my blood pressure rising. Laughing at what? "Catherine, what did you see?" She turned to face me, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound sadness and pure rage. It was the property deed. It was framed hanging right behind the mahogany desk. I walked closer, pretending to admire the woodwork. "Richard, I saw the names on that official document. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. David and Monica, I stated firmly, though a sickening doubt was already spreading through my chest. No, Catherine whispered. David's name is nowhere on that deed. Monica's name is nowhere on that deed. The property is registered solely to a limited liability company, an LLC, an LLC. I repeated my mind, racing through corporate legalities. What LLC? Kensington Holdings, Catherine replied. The air in the car suddenly felt heavy, unbreathable. Kensington. That was Beatrix's maiden name. The name she constantly used to boast about her imaginary aristocratic heritage. I stared at the dark windshield, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what my wife was telling me. Are you absolutely certain? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. I am certain, Catherine said, wiping her face. I saw the state seal. I saw the registration date. It was filed 3 weeks ago, right after you wired the money. Richard, you did not buy a house for our son. You bought a $2.5 million estate for Beatrice. She owns it all. I sat in the dark, the silence deafening. 40 years of hard work. 40 years of sacrificing family dinners to build a company, all to ensure my son would have a secure future. And he had taken my life savings and handed the keys to his manipulative mother-in-law. My own flesh and blood had orchestrated a massive deception right under my nose. The disrespect was paralyzing. The betrayal was absolute. A cold, calculated fury replaced the shock. I am not a man who gets emotional. I am a man who solves problems. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed David's personal cell number. I listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times. I pictured my son standing in that lavish living room holding a drink, playing the successful homeowner, while his mother-in-law held the actual power. The call finally connected. David, I said firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet car. We need to talk right now. But it was not my son's voice on the other end of the phone line. A high-pitched, sickeningly arrogant laugh echoed loudly through the small speaker. Oh, Richard, Beatrix's voice purred with deep satisfaction. David is far too busy moving my antique furniture into the huge master bedroom. Thank you so much for the truly lovely little gift. The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen of my phone. The silence inside the car was broken only by my wife softly crying next to me. Beatrice had just confirmed every single fear taking root in my chest. I put the car in gear and drove us straight home. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat in my home office surrounded by the walls where I drafted the original business plans for Caldwell Logistics 40 years ago. I booted up my computer and logged into the county property portal. It took less than 10 minutes to find exactly what Catherine had seen. The deed to the $2.5 million estate was formally registered to Kensington Holdings, a limited liability company. I pulled the corporate registry. The sole managing member of Kensington Holdings was Beatrice. My son and daughter-in-law held zero equity in the home my $1.2 million down payment had secured. I printed every page. The printer hummed, churning out the concrete evidence of my son's betrayal. I placed the papers in a manila folder and waited for sunrise. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, I pulled into the executive parking lot of Caldwell Logistics. Usually, I arrived at this sprawling glass and steel building with a sense of immense pride. Today, I felt nothing but a cold dread settling deep in my bones. I walked past the security desk with a brief nod. I bypassed my own office suite and walked directly toward the financial wing. David was the chief financial officer. I had handed him that title 3 years ago, believing he possessed the integrity to manage the empire I intended to leave him. I never imagined I would be confronting him like this. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his office without knocking. David was sitting behind his massive desk sipping coffee, his eyes glued to a dual monitor setup. He looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. "Dad," he said quickly, masking his surprise with a practiced, easy smile. "What are you doing here so early? I thought you and Mom were taking the morning off after the party. We missed you when it came time for the toast." I did not return his smile. I stopped right in front of his desk. I looked at this man, my son, trying to find a trace of the honest boy I had raised. Instead, I saw a polished executive wearing a tailored suit bought with my money sitting in an office I built spinning a web of deceit. I opened the manila folder. I did not say a single word as I took the printed county property records and slammed them down onto the center of his desk. David flinched. His eyes dropped to the papers. I watched the blood drain completely from his face. His confident posture crumbled in an instant. A bead of sweat formed near his hairline as he scanned the highlighted name on the corporate registry. Kensington Holdings. Care to explain why my $1.2 million down payment purchased a mansion for your mother-in-law? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Dad, listen, it is not what it looks like. He finally stammered, his voice lacking its usual smooth authority. You do not have the full picture. There are things you do not understand about how we structured this. I understand perfectly, I replied, leaning closer to his desk. I understand that I gave you the money to secure a future for your family, and you secretly handed the deed over to Beatrice. She even answered your phone last night to mock me about it. So, you have exactly 1 minute to tell me the truth before I call the bank and report a massive financial fraud. David wiped his forehead. He was panicking. Before he could invent a suitable lie, the office door swung open. Monica walked in carrying a tray of expensive pastries and 2 designer coffees. Richard, she said, her voice overly sweet, we did not expect you today. Obviously, I replied, not breaking eye contact with David. Monica walked over to her husband, her eyes catching the property documents spread across the mahogany desk. I saw her posture stiffen, a defensive wall immediately going up. She looked at David, then turned her gaze toward me, her expression hardening. The sweet daughter-in-law act evaporated. Did you actually go digging through public records just to spy on us? Monica asked, her tone dripping with sudden indignation. She placed her hands on her hips, positioning herself slightly in front of David like a shield. I cannot believe you would violate our privacy like this. Richard D., violate your privacy? I repeated, my voice rising slightly. I handed you over $1 million of my hard-earned money. Monica, I have every right to know whose name is on the title of that property. It was a gift. She snapped back. A gift means you let it go. It means you trust your son to make the right decisions for his family. Instead, you are sneaking around behind our backs, investigating us like we are criminals. It is incredibly controlling. Richard, frankly, it is toxic. David quickly picked up on her cue, finding his courage now that he had reinforcements. Monica is right, Dad, he said, shaking his head slowly. We are adults. You cannot just storm into my office and hurl accusations because you do not understand modern financial planning. You are reacting emotionally instead of logically. I felt a sickening twist in my gut. They were completely united in this manipulation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at me not with remorse, but with unified annoyance. Reacting emotionally, I asked quietly, you call secretly transferring a $2.5 million asset to Beatrice logical? David let out a long, heavy sigh. He reached down and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. I did not want to bother you with the complicated mechanics of our wealth management strategy. Dad, you are supposed to be stepping back and enjoying your pre-retirement. But since you insist on assuming the absolute worst about your own son, I will show you. David pulled out a thick black folder with a gold-embossed accounting firm logo on the cover. He dropped it onto the desk. He placed his hands flat on the smooth leather cover, his eyes meeting mine with a terrifyingly calm, calculated confidence. He was no longer sweating. He was fully prepared to spin an intricate web of lies right to my face. Sit down, Dad, David said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. Let me explain to you exactly how the tax system works. This folder contains the answers to your reckless assumptions, he added, his voice dripping with condescension. And when I finish, I expect a full apology for this unwarranted intrusion. I looked at the folder. then back up at my son. 40 years of hard work had come down to this moment. He really believed I was a naive old man who would blindly accept his next lie. David opened the folder with slow, deliberate movements, smoothing the pages flat with his palms. He cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to mirror the confident executive persona I had spent years training him to project. Dad, the world of real estate and large-scale financial transfers is not as simple as it was when you bought your first house 40 years ago. We are dealing with substantial sums of money here, and the federal government is constantly looking for ways to penalize families for intergenerational wealth transfers. If you had just wired the money directly into our personal accounts, we would have been hit with an absolutely staggering gift tax liability. It would have financially crippled us before we even moved a single piece of furniture into the living room. He pointed a manicured finger at a dense spreadsheet filled with projected tax brackets and depreciation schedules. Monica's mother has a phenomenal accountant, a man who manages portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in the state. He advised us that the safest, most fiscally responsible way to handle your generous contribution was to route it through a temporary holding vehicle. Kensington Holdings is just a shell company. Dad, it is a protective barrier. Beatrice is acting as a temporary trustee to shelter the asset, according to the strategic timeline laid out right here in these documents. The limited liability company will be completely dissolved in exactly 90 days. On the 91st day, the property deed will automatically transfer entirely into Monica's and my name. We were trying to protect your investment, not steal it. We just wanted to handle the stressful logistics ourselves so you could focus on enjoying your retirement. It was a masterful performance. The financial terminology was perfectly deployed. The logic was completely sound on the surface, designed to sound responsible and highly professional. If I were an ordinary, uneducated man, I might have been instantly relieved. I might have praised my son for his brilliant foresight. But I spent my entire adult life navigating corporate tax law to build Caldwell Logistics. I knew instantly that every single word coming out of his mouth was a meticulously crafted lie. You do not use a mother-in-law's personal limited liability company to bypass federal gift taxes on a primary residence. It was legally absurd. It was a fairy tale dressed up in corporate jargon. I kept my face completely blank. I did not interrupt him. I let the silence hang in the air after he finished speaking. That silence made Monica incredibly anxious. She realized David's spreadsheet presentation was not enough to extinguish the burning suspicion in my eyes. She stepped forward, abandoning the aggressive stance for something far more manipulative. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her eyes filled with perfectly timed crystalline tears. "Richard, how could you think so poorly of us?" she asked, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak. "How could you believe we would ever do something so malicious?" My mother has spent the last month working herself to the point of exhaustion, meeting with lawyers and accountants just to make sure David and I were protected. She took on the legal liability of the holding company solely to help us secure our dream home. She is making a massive sacrifice for our family, and instead of thanking her, you are treating her like some kind of scheming criminal. She reached out and placed a trembling hand on David's shoulder. "We have worked so hard to build a life that would make you and Catherine proud. We wanted to surprise you when the title officially transferred in 90 days. We wanted to show you that we are responsible adults who know how to protect our family assets. But you could not even give us the benefit of the doubt. You just assumed the absolute worst. Your lack of trust is deeply wounding. Richard, it feels like no matter what David does, no matter how hard he tries to be the son you want, you will always find a way to make him feel like a failure. You are trying to control our marriage with your money, and it is tearing this family apart." David stood up from his leather chair and walked around the desk to wrap his arm protectively around his crying wife. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. "Please, Dad," he begged, his voice softening into a plea for paternal sympathy. "Do not ruin the family harmony over a simple misunderstanding about temporary tax structures. Mom was so upset last night. Monica is devastated right now. We all just want to move forward and enjoy the beautiful home you helped us acquire. Just give it 90 days. You will see the deed transfer. You will see that everything I am telling you is the absolute truth. Just trust me." I stood there in the center of the office, surrounded by the empire I had built from nothing. I looked at the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home. They were looking at me with expectant, tear-filled eyes, waiting for me to yield. My gut was screaming that this was only the surface of a much darker, far more dangerous conspiracy. The lie about the tax loophole was too rehearsed. Monica's tears were too convenient. Beatrice's arrogant laughter on the phone the night before did not match the narrative of a selfless, sacrificing mother. I realized in that exact moment that confronting them directly with logic and anger would yield absolutely nothing. They were prepared for a fight. They were not prepared for a surrender. If I wanted to uncover the actual truth, I needed them to believe they had successfully fooled me. I needed them to drop their guard. I needed to become the clueless, weary old man they thought I was. I let my shoulders slump forward intentionally, shrinking my posture. I reached up and pinched the bridge of my nose, letting out a long, shaky sigh that sounded like defeat. I forced my expression to soften from cold fury to genuine exhaustion. "I am sorry," I whispered, my voice intentionally weak. "I am just getting old. David, the world moves so fast now, and these modern financial structures are incredibly confusing to me. When your mother saw Beatrix's name on that deed last night, it gave us both a terrible shock. We panicked. I did not mean to accuse you of anything malicious. I just want to know that you and Monica are safe and secure. I want to know my hard work actually helped you. I apologize for overreacting and storming in here. You are right. I should have trusted you." The physical transformation in the room was instantaneous. The defensive tension completely evaporated from David's shoulders. Monica sniffled and wiped her eyes, offering me a weak, forgiving smile. They exchanged a very quick, subtle look of absolute victory. They had won. The old man had folded. "It is okay, Dad," David said, his voice returning to its normal, confident tone. "I know you were just looking out for us. We appreciate the apology. Let us just put this behind us and focus on the future." "Thank you, son," I replied softly. "I will let you get back to work. We can talk more about the house later." I turned my back to them and began walking slowly toward the heavy glass door of the office. I moved with the heavy, shuffling steps of a defeated man. I reached out and grabbed the brushed steel handle. As I pulled the heavy door open, the bright fluorescent lights of the hallway illuminated the thick glass pane, turning it into a perfect dark mirror. The angle of the reflection captured the area directly behind the mahogany desk. David thought I was no longer paying attention. He thought I was broken. In the reflection of the glass, I saw him practically dive back into his leather chair. He grabbed his computer mouse and began clicking frantically. I watched his screen reflect in the doorway. He was aggressively dragging a specific digital folder directly into the system's trash bin. The text on the screen was large enough to read clearly in the reflection. It was a folder he was absolutely desperate to hide from me. The title of the deleted file burned itself into my memory. Caldwell_pension transfers. The drive home was a blur of calculated silence. The image of my son frantically deleting a file named Caldwell pension transfers played on a continuous loop in my mind. A tax loophole for a luxury house was one thing, a simple deception born of typical greed. But intentionally touching the employee pension fund crossed a moral line so severe it bordered on the unthinkable. I had hundreds of hardworking people who trusted me with their retirement. If David was moving their money, he was not just stealing from me. He was destroying the lives of people who had spent their entire careers building my company. I needed to know exactly who was pulling the strings. David was arrogant, but he was inherently cautious. He simply did not have the nerve to orchestrate a massive financial crime on his own. Someone was pushing him. I needed to see the dynamic inside that house when they thought no one was watching. I stopped at a boutique downtown and purchased an extravagant crystal vase. It was the perfect apology gift serving as an olive branch from a defeated father. I arrived at the estate just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The wrought iron gates were wide open. Landscaping crews were busy manicuring the vast front lawn. I parked near the fountain and walked up the stone steps holding the crystal vase tightly. I did not ring the bell. The heavy oak front door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside the grand foyer, quietly letting the shadows conceal my arrival. The house echoed with the demanding voice of Monica's mother. I walked silently down the marble hallway, following the sound of Beatrix's piercing voice into the main living room. What I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a masterclass in psychological domination. David, the chief financial officer of a $40 million empire, was literally on his hands and knees. He was holding a measuring tape against the edge of a massive Persian rug. Beatrice was standing directly over him, holding a china cup of tea. She looked down at him with pure disgust. "Move it exactly 2 into the left. David," she barked, her tone dripping with venom. "I told you repeatedly that I wanted it perfectly centered with the chandelier. Are you completely incapable of following a simple instruction?" David fumbled with the heavy fabric, his hands visibly shaking. "Sorry, Beatrice." He mumbled, his voice barely audible, not daring to look up at her. "I will fix it right now." Beatrice scoffed loudly, a sound filled with deep contempt. She snapped her fingers at him twice, a sharp, degrading sound. "Hurry up and fix it. The interior designer is arriving in 20 minutes, and I will not have my home looking like a chaotic mess because of your incompetence." I watched my son shrink into himself, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The confident executive who tried to intimidate me just hours ago was gone. He was a terrified, obedient servant in his own supposed home, bowing to the whims of a tyrant. I took a heavy step forward, letting my shoes click loudly against the marble floor. David jumped up instantly, brushing the dust off his slacks, his face flushing bright red with embarrassment. Beatrice turned around, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as she saw me holding the crystal vase. Monica walked in from the adjoining kitchen, stopping dead in her tracks when she spotted me. "Richard, Monica said, her voice tight and defensive. "What are you doing here without calling first?" I forced a warm, apologetic smile onto my face. "I came to bring this," I said, holding up the gleaming vase. "I wanted to formally apologize for my behavior this morning. I overstepped my bounds, and I want to respect your boundaries moving forward. I just want peace between us." Beatrice looked at the vase, her lips slowly curling into a smug, victorious smile. "Well, that is very mature of you, Richard. Just put it on the side table and do not scratch the wood." I placed the vase down gently and turned my attention to David. He was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. I needed to see how deep this control went. "David," I said casually, keeping my tone light and conversational, "while I am here, I wanted to quickly ask you about the fourth quarter financial projections for the regional distribution centers. Are we still on track to open the new warehouse in Ohio by November?" It was a basic question, something any executive should be able to answer in his sleep. David opened his mouth to speak, but Monica stepped directly in front of him. She physically blocked him from my view, acting like a guard dog. "David is not working today." "Richard," Monica said, her voice sharp and commanding, "we are focusing entirely on setting up my mother's new house. Your little trucking company can wait until Monday morning. He is not answering your stressful work questions right now." I looked past her shoulder, trying to catch David's eye. He simply nodded, staring blankly at the freshly painted wall. "Monica is right, Dad," he whispered softly, sounding entirely defeated. "I am busy with the house. We can talk about logistics next week." The psychological horror of the situation settled over me. My son had zero control over his own life, his money, or his voice. He was subjugated. They had stripped him of his autonomy, turning him into a compliant tool for their financial gain. "Of course," I said, maintaining my weary facade. "I completely understand. I will just use the restroom and let you all get back to your busy day. I walked past the living room and headed straight down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. I knew exactly where Beatrice had claimed her private study. It was the same room where Catherine had seen the framed property deed. The heavy wooden door was wide open. I slipped quietly inside the room. The space smelled strongly of expensive perfume and leather. I walked quickly toward her massive mahogany desk, my eyes scanning rapidly for any loose documents. As I stepped around the heavy leather chair, the toe of my shoe caught the edge of an ornate metal trash can. It tipped over instantly, spilling its crumpled contents across the pristine hardwood floor. I crouched down to clean up the mess before anyone heard the noise. As I reached for a crumpled ball of paper, a brightly colored logo caught my eye. I carefully flattened out the ripped pages against my knee. They were final notice letters from 3 different offshore casinos located in the Caribbean. The letters were addressed directly to Beatrix Kensington. The bold red ink at the bottom demanded immediate wire transfers to settle outstanding markers. I stared at the staggering numbers printed on the paper. Beatrice was not a wealthy aristocrat sheltering assets from the government. She was just a degenerate gambler, severely drowning in tens of millions of dollars of offshore debt, and she was using my son and my company's pension fund to pay for her own pathetic survival. I placed the ripped pieces of the casino final notice letters back into the ornate metal trash can, arranging them exactly as I had found them. My hands were surprisingly steady. Despite the hurricane of rage and realization tearing through my mind, Beatrice was drowning in offshore gambling debt, and my son was her financial lifeline. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and took a deep, stabilizing breath. I walked out of the private study and back down the long, opulent hallway toward the main living area. Monica and David were standing exactly where I had left them, their postures still radiating a mix of defensive tension and smug superiority. I offered them both a polite, weary smile, playing the role of the defeated, oblivious father to perfection. I told them I was glad we had cleared the air, wished them a wonderful afternoon, setting up their home, and quietly showed myself out the front door. The drive back to my own house felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating fog. The pieces of the puzzle were horrifyingly clear now. David was not just a naive husband trying to appease a demanding mother-in-law with a tax loophole. He was an active, willing participant in a massive financial crime. When I arrived home, Catherine was waiting for me in the kitchen, her eyes wide with anxious anticipation. I poured myself a small glass of water and sat down across from her at the kitchen island, speaking in hushed tones. I told her everything. I told her about the degrading way Beatrice treated our son, the deleted computer folder regarding the company pension fund, and the ripped casino debt collection letters hiding in the trash can. Catherine covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes as the sheer scale of the betrayal washed over her. Our son was stealing from us to fund a gambling addiction. We have to call the police. Richard, Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow. We have to stop him before he ruins everything we have ever built. I shook my head slowly, reaching across the marble counter to grasp her trembling hands. No, I replied softly but firmly. If we confront him now or involve the authorities prematurely, David will simply erase the remaining digital evidence. He is the chief financial officer. He controls the servers. He controls the daily ledgers. He will claim I am a confused old man making wild accusations, and Monica will back him up completely. We cannot win a war of words against 2 people who have spent months perfecting their lies. If we are going to stop this, I need undeniable concrete proof. I need the raw financial data downloaded directly from the company servers, and I have to get it without David ever knowing I was looking. I spent the rest of the evening acting completely normal. I ate dinner with Catherine, watched the evening news, and went to bed at my usual time. I needed to ensure that if David was monitoring my behavior in any way, he would see nothing but a tired, retired executive settling into a quiet life. But sleep was entirely out of the question. I lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock, waiting for the dead of night. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, I quietly slipped out of bed, leaving Catherine sleeping soundly. I walked down the hallway to my home office and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, the blue light from the screen illuminating the dark room. It was time to investigate the company I had spent 40 years of my life building from the ground up. David was a highly educated financial executive, but he suffered from the blinding arrogance of youth. When I handed him the keys to the financial kingdom 3 years ago, he immediately changed all the primary administrative passwords, subtly locking me out of the day-to-day operational metrics. He wanted total control, and he believed his modern cybersecurity protocols were impenetrable. But David had forgotten a crucial detail about Caldwell Logistics. I was not just the founder. I was the man who personally supervised the installation of the original network architecture 2 decades ago. Before we had dedicated information technology departments, I coded the legacy administrative backdoor access portals myself. I opened a command terminal on my laptop and began typing strings of old hidden credentials that had not been actively used in over 15 years. I held my breath as the screen loaded, praying the old security patches were still buried deep within the server framework. The screen flashed green. I was in. I completely bypassed the superficial, highly sanitized quarterly reports that David usually presented to the board of directors during our formal meetings. I needed to see the raw, unfiltered data. I navigated directly into the Master Chief Financial Officer ledger, the central nervous system of our entire corporate operation. I began pulling up the vendor payout logs for the last 12 months, scanning row after row of thousands of transactions. I was looking for anomalies, unauthorized bonuses, or phantom contractors. For the first hour, everything looked infuriatingly normal. Legitimate invoices for fuel vehicle maintenance, warehouse leases, and employee payroll rolled across the screen. David had hidden his tracks exceptionally well, burying his theft beneath mountains of routine corporate expenditures. My eyes were burning from staring at the bright screen, but I refused to stop scrolling. Then I finally saw it. It was a recurring monthly payment authorized directly by the Chief Financial Officer. $30,000 precisely categorized under the vague heading of Strategic Logistics Consulting. The vendor receiving these massive monthly transfers was listed simply as Bidge Consulting. I clicked the vendor profile, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled up the registration and billing address attached to the account. It was a rent-controlled apartment complex on the south side of Chicago. It was the exact address where Beatrice had lived before Monica married my son B. Ridge Beatrice. It was so brazen, so completely arrogant that it made my blood boil. David was funneling $30,000 a month of my company's revenue directly to his mother-in-law to feed her gambling addiction. He was draining the accounts dry to pay offshore casino creditors. The entitlement required to execute this scheme was absolutely staggering. I reached out to initiate a mass download of the records. My finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to secure the undeniable proof I needed to save my legacy. I clicked the primary extraction icon, expecting a progress bar to appear. But before the download could even begin to process, the entire computer screen suddenly froze completely and flashed a violent, blinding red color. A high-priority security system warning popped up directly in the center of the dark monitor. The text message was incredibly loud and absolutely clear. Admin override detected, alerting CFO immediately. The trap had been sprung without warning. David now knew for an absolute fact that an unauthorized user was actively inside his secure network. He knew someone was hunting him. I stared at the blinding red warning on my monitor before acting. I pressed the power button, holding it down until the screen went completely black and the fan died away. The silence returned, but my mind was racing. David would receive that automated alert instantly. Given the magnitude of the financial crimes he was committing, panic would completely consume him. He would not wait until regular business hours to investigate a Heil breach. He would come here directly to the source of the override codes. I had to be absolutely ready for him. I closed the laptop, pulling a stack of old physical retirement portfolio folders from my drawer and scattering them haphazardly across the desk. I needed the room to look like the disorganized workspace of an elderly man struggling to understand his finances. I walked upstairs, quietly, slipped back into bed beside Catherine, and watched the clock on the nightstand slowly tick toward dawn. I did not close my eyes. I simply waited for the inevitable arrival of my desperate son. At 6:15, the harsh crunch of tires gripping the driveway shattered the morning quiet. A car door slammed shut with aggressive force. A few seconds later, a series of rapid, heavy knocks pounded against our front door. Catherine stirred beside me in alarm. I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her to stay in bed, promising I would handle whoever was downstairs. I pulled on my thick bathrobe, intentionally tying the belt slightly off center. I ruffled my gray hair to ensure I looked disheveled and freshly awakened. I walked slowly down the wooden staircase, making my footsteps sound heavy and fatigued. The knocking resumed, bordering on frantic. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. David stood on the front porch, bathed in the pale light of early dawn. He looked completely unraveled. He was wearing the same dress pants from the day before, paired with a wrinkled t-shirt. His eyes were bloodshot, darting wildly around the foyer, as if expecting to find federal agents waiting to place him in handcuffs. "David," I said, keeping my voice thick with sleep and laced with mild paternal confusion. "What in the world are you doing here at this hour? Is someone hurt?" He pushed past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. He stood in the center of the foyer, breathing heavily, trying desperately to compose himself. He ran a trembling hand through his messy hair. "Dad, we have a massive corporate emergency," he said, his voice tight. "The primary financial servers at the company were breached last night. Someone triggered a master administrative override at 2 o'clock in the morning. My security protocols flagged a catastrophic unauthorized entry right from the legacy access portals. I drove straight over here because the physical IP address pinged back to this residential network. Did someone break into your home office?" I watched him perform his desperate routine. He was trying to frame his sheer terror as diligent executive concern. He needed to know if I was pulling the strings or if some anonymous hacker was currently downloading his illegal transactions. I let my shoulders slump. I raised a trembling hand to my forehead, rubbing my temples as if battling a severe morning headache. I let out a long, heavy sigh of profound embarrassment. "Oh, David," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea it would cause such a terrible commotion. There are no hackers, son. It was just me." David froze completely. The remaining color drained from his face as he braced himself for the worst. "You?" he asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "What do you mean it was you? What were you doing in the central ledger at 2 in the morning?" I shook my head. Playing the role of a deeply frustrated, technologically incompetent senior citizen to absolute perfection, I could not sleep. I explained, my voice wavering slightly with manufactured shame. "I came downstairs to look over my personal retirement portfolios. You know, I like to review the quarterly yields, but that new financial software you installed last month is completely impossible to navigate. I could not figure out how to access my private shareholder dashboards. I kept clicking on different menus, and these warning boxes kept popping up on the screen." I gestured weakly toward the hallway leading to my office. I tried using my old master passwords from back when we ran the legacy systems, hoping it would just bypass the new security walls. I guess I must have triggered an alarm. The screen suddenly flashed red, and the computer completely froze on me. I got so frustrated with the glowing warnings that I just unplugged the machine from the wall and went back to sleep. "I am so sorry I woke you up in a panic." "David, I was just trying to read my pension statements, and I ended up breaking the entire system. I feel like an absolute fool." I looked up at him, my eyes wide and apologetic. I waited for his reaction. I watched the profound, intoxicating relief wash over his entire body. The terror in his bloodshot eyes instantly dissolved, replaced immediately by a familiar, sickening arrogance. He let out a loud, dramatic exhale, dropping his head back and staring at the ceiling, as if asking the universe for patience with a foolish child. The transition from a panicked criminal to a condescending superior was seamless. Unbelievable. David scoffed, his tone dripping with patronizing irritation. You unplugged the machine. Dad, you cannot just randomly input deprecated administrative codes into a modernized corporate network. You triggered a level 5 security cascade. I thought we were experiencing a coordinated cyber attack from a foreign entity. You practically gave me a heart attack over a simple retirement statement. He shook his head, placing a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture meant to assert dominance. Listen to me, he said, speaking slowly as if addressing a toddler. You are getting too old to be messing around with advanced technology. The systems are vastly different now. They are highly sensitive. You need to leave the technical operations to me and my team. If you ever want to review your personal pension files, you call my assistant. We will print out a physical copy. Do not try to log into the servers yourself ever again. You are just going to cause unnecessary damage. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. You are absolutely right, son, I murmured. I will leave the heavy lifting to you. I am sorry. David patted my shoulder. Just get some rest. Dad, let the younger generation handle the details. He turned and walked out and the front door. I watched him through the side window. When his luxury car vanished around the corner, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I grabbed my burner phone and dialed a secure number. Thomas, I said, my voice cold and stripped of all paternal mercy. I need you to quietly tear my son's life apart. Thomas Bradley was not a man who asked questions. He was a forensic auditor who operated in the dark, a phantom who could trace a single stolen dollar through a labyrinth of international shell companies and encrypted offshore accounts. When I hung up the burner phone, I felt the first genuine sense of calm I had experienced in days. The trap was set. Now I just had to play my part. The opportunity presented itself that very Friday. Catherine had invited David, Monica, and Beatrice over for a family dinner. It was a long-standing tradition, but tonight it felt like setting the stage for a psychological war. Catherine spent the entire afternoon preparing her signature roast, completely unaware of the digital excavation Thomas was currently performing on our son. I had not told her about my midnight discovery in the corporate ledger or my call to Thomas. I needed her reactions to be entirely authentic. If David suspected for a single second that we were plotting against him, he would panic and destroy the servers. They arrived exactly at 7 o'clock. David walked through the front door with a bottle of expensive wine, wearing a relaxed, confident smile. The panic from the early morning system alert had completely vanished from his face. He believed he had successfully neutralized the threat. He believed his father was just a technologically illiterate old man who had fumbled his way into the wrong computer file. Monica followed close behind him, carrying a bouquet of flowers, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. And then came Beatrice. She swept into our home as if she were a reigning monarch inspecting a peasant village. She wore a tailored silk dress and diamond jewelry that I now knew was financed by the stolen retirement funds of my hardworking employees. She greeted Catherine with a stiff, obligatory embrace before immediately commenting on the temperature of the house, complaining that the air conditioning was far too aggressive for her delicate constitution. We moved into the dining room. Catherine brought out the roast surrounded by roasted vegetables and fresh herbs. It was a beautiful, warm, comforting meal. Beatrice looked at the platters with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. She picked up her silver fork and prodded a piece of the meat as if examining a biological specimen. This is so wonderfully rustic. Catherine, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. It reminds me of the simple meals my grandmother used to make during the rationing years. It is incredibly quaint. You must give my personal chef your recipe. He is always looking for ways to create heavy filling dishes for the landscaping crew. Catherine's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and hurt. She looked down at her plate, the joy completely draining from her eyes. Monica let out a soft, melodic laugh, reaching over to pat Catherine's hand. Do not mind Catherine. She has just grown accustomed to a very particular standard of culinary artistry lately. Her new diet is strictly organic imported ingredients. I sat at the head of the table, cutting my meat with slow, deliberate precision. I forced a warm, oblivious smile onto my face. I looked at Beatrice and nodded enthusiastically, completely ignoring the vicious insult she had just hurled at my wife. Well, we are just simple people. Beatrice, I said, my voice intentionally cheerful and naive. We stick to the classics. I am just glad we could all get together and enjoy the evening as a family. It is wonderful to see you all so relaxed and happy. David beamed, taking a large sip of his wine. He leaned back in his chair completely at ease. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk, thoroughly enjoying his perceived superiority. It is a great evening, Dad, David said smoothly. Everything is running perfectly. You really do not have a single thing to worry about anymore. Just sit back and let me handle the heavy lifting. Right at that exact moment, the burner phone hidden deep in my left trouser pocket vibrated a single sharp pulse. I kept my smile frozen in place. I casually lowered my left hand under the heavy mahogany dining table, slipping the small device out of my pocket. I kept my eyes locked on David, nodding along to whatever mundane story he had begun to tell about his golf handicap. Under the table. I pressed my thumb against the screen to unlock it. The brightness was turned all the way down, casting only a faint glow against my palm. It was a text message from Thomas Bradley. The forensic excavation had begun to strike gold. The first message was brief and clinical. Kensington Holdings is a hollow shell registered in Delaware. Zero legitimate business operations. Sole purpose is acting as a pass-through entity for inbound wire transfers. I took a bite of my food, chewing slowly as Beatrice began to complain about the quality of the wine David had brought. I glanced down again. A second message materialized on the screen. I have breached the Bidge consulting ledger. You were right. It is completely fraudulent. No employees, no services rendered. The monthly $30,000 consulting fees from Caldwell Logistics are automatically routed through a payment processor directly into an account held by the Grand Cayman Royal Bank. I looked across the table at Beatrice. She was currently dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, complaining that the lighting in our dining room was terribly unflattering. This woman who was critiquing the aesthetics of my home was a financial parasite draining my life's work. My phone vibrated again. A third message. I intercepted the outbound routing numbers from the Cayman account. The money does not stay there. Within 24 hours of receiving the Caldwell funds, wire transfers are executed to 3 separate entities: Sunround Casino Group, Horizon Island, Betting, and a private debt consolidation firm operating out of Macau. She is moving money faster than she can steal it. The debt is astronomical. She is leveraging the house to cover the margins. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. David was sitting right in front of me, laughing at a joke Monica had just made, completely unaware that his entire criminal enterprise was being dismantled piece by piece beneath my dinner plate. He was so arrogant, so blindly confident in his own intelligence that he never stopped to consider the possibility that I was hunting him. I watched Catherine offer Beatrice another serving of vegetables. Beatrice declined with a dramatic wave of her hand, claiming she had already consumed far too many simple carbohydrates for one evening. I wanted to scream, but I remained perfectly still. I had to let Thomas finish the job. My phone vibrated one final time. It was a longer, continuous pulse. I kept my face perfectly neutral as I lowered my gaze. The text from Thomas was stark and absolute. Richard, step outside. You need to hear this. They aren't just stealing the company's cash flow. The words on the screen sent a sharp spike of adrenaline straight into my chest. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath. I looked up at the dining table. David was swirling his wine, completely satisfied with his stolen life. Monica was smiling at him. They were a portrait of perfect, oblivious arrogance. I cleared my throat softly, drawing their attention. "Excuse me for a moment," I said. keeping my voice mild. I think the roast was a bit rich. I am going to step outside for a breath of fresh evening air. Catherine looked at me with concern. I offered a reassuring smile and pushed my chair away. I walked through the kitchen and slipped out the glass door. The cool night air hit my face, but did nothing to calm the burning fury inside me. I walked across the lawn, slipping through the back gate, leading to a quiet, poorly lit parking lot behind our community center. Thomas Bradley was waiting exactly where I knew he would be. His dark sedan was parked in the deepest shadows beneath a cluster of oak trees. I opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat. The interior was bathed in the pale blue glow of a laptop screen. Thomas did not offer a greeting. He traded exclusively in hard facts. "You need to brace yourself, Richard," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I spent the last 3 hours digging through your son's digital footprint. He is not just skimming cash. He has engineered a financial catastrophe, steering the entire ship directly into a concrete wall." I looked at the glowing screen. "Tell me exactly what you found." "I already know Beatrice is gambling away the company cash flow through those fake consulting fees." Thomas shook his head. "The casinos cut her off 6 months ago. Beatrice turned to alternative funding sources. She owes an international syndicate of loan sharks over $2 million. They demand weekly tribute and the interest rates are compounding at an astronomical pace. She is drowning and she dragged your son into the deep water with her." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "So David is draining the operating accounts to keep her alive." I stated, "It is much worse than the operating accounts." Thomas replied, $30,000 a month is not enough to cover the weekly tribute Beatrice owes to these syndicates. David needed a massive pool of untraceable liquidity. He crossed the ultimate line. He is actively draining the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. "The pension fund?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "He is stealing the retirement savings of my workers, men and women who have given their entire lives to my company. He has already siphoned over $4 million from the principal reserves," Thomas confirmed, bringing up a complex series of ledger transfers. "He is routing it through Beatrix's shell company, sending it directly to Macau. He is burning the futures of your employees to pay for his mother-in-law's gambling debts." My son was a monster, but Thomas was not finished. "There is a reason he felt comfortable taking such an insane risk." Thomas continued, "David is a coward. He knew touching the federal pension funds would attract the authorities. He needed an absolute guarantee that he would walk away clean when the house of cards collapsed. He needed a designated fall guy." "He set me up," I said quietly, the realization settling over me. "He framed you perfectly," Thomas said, dropping a thick stack of printed documents onto my lap. "I found these buried in a hidden partition on the main server. David used your digital signature to forge binding legal declarations. He drafted documents naming you as the sole guarantor of Beatrix's massive syndicate debts. He forged executive orders authorizing the creation of the phantom subsidiaries, draining the pension fund. Every wire transfer, every illegal loan, every stolen dollar has your name attached to it at the top of the command chain." I stared down at the papers in my lap. The forged signatures looked perfectly authentic. The legal language was ironclad. If federal authorities launch an investigation, or if the loan sharks decide to collect their principal balance by force, all the paper trails lead directly to your home office, Thomas explained. "David structured this entire criminal enterprise so he looks like an innocent subordinate following the erratic orders of his aging father. If this operation goes bust, Richard, you are the one going to federal prison. You will die in a cell, and David will assume total control of whatever assets remain." The terrifying reality locked my jaw. My own flesh and blood had systematically planned my financial ruin and physical incarceration. I spent 40 years building a legacy of honor, and David had twisted it into a noose meant for my neck. I looked toward my home where my son was currently drinking my wine and smiling at my wife. "How long do we have before the annual corporate audit?" I asked, my voice turning into a cold, mechanical rasp. "The external auditors arrive in 3 weeks. When they look at the pension reserves, they will spot the massive deficit. The entire scheme will unravel." Thomas let out a slow, heavy breath. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out one final document protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. He held it out toward me. The ambient light from the laptop illuminated the bold text at the top of the page. "David knows about the upcoming audit," Thomas said quietly. "He knows the deficit cannot be hidden from external regulators. He does not plan on letting you take the fall after the audit happens. He is going to spring the trap before the auditors even arrive at the building." I took the plastic sleeve from his hand. I read the title of the document. My blood turned to ice in my veins. "It is a drafted, legally binding petition for emergency medical conservatorship," Thomas explained, his tone laced with genuine disgust. "I intercepted emails between David Monica and an unethical private judge. They are planning to file this petition next week in a closed session. They are going to testify under oath that your recent behavior has become erratic and dangerous. They will claim you are suffering from severe dementia and actively destroying the company with reckless financial decisions." I stared at the petition. It outlined a complete seizure of my personal rights and medical autonomy. It painted me as a broken man incapable of caring for himself. "Once the judge signs that order, you immediately lose all legal authority," Thomas said. "David and Monica will be granted total control over your life and Caldwell logistics. They will lock you away in a secure memory care facility, isolating you from the outside world. You will not be able to talk to Catherine, your lawyers, or the authorities. Once silenced, David will use his power as conservator to cover his tracks. Blame the missing pension funds on your supposed decline and walk away with everything." They were going to bury me alive. I sat in the dark passenger seat of Thomas Bradley's car, staring at the drafted conservatorship petition. They were going to bury me alive. The sheer scale of their cruelty washed over me, replacing the last remaining fragments of my paternal love with cold, absolute resolve. I handed the plastic sleeve back to Thomas. I did not shed a single tear. I looked at the forensic auditor and nodded. The time for sorrow had passed. It was time to go to war. I told Thomas to begin securing the evidence immediately, instructing him to trace every stolen dollar and build an impenetrable fortress around my personal assets. I stepped out of his car and walked back through the damp grass toward my home. The next morning, I initiated the performance of my life. If David and Monica needed me to be a senile, confused old man to validate their fraudulent court petition, I was going to give them a masterpiece. I walked into the kitchen where Catherine was pouring coffee and David was standing near the island, reviewing a report on his tablet. I intentionally shuffled my feet, letting my posture sag heavily. I looked directly at my son and let a blank, vacant expression wash over my face. "Good morning, Michael," I said, using the name of my late brother. "Did you finish the inventory logs for the warehouse yet?" David froze, lowering his tablet slowly. He exchanged a rapid, wide-eyed look with Catherine. "Dad," David said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "It is me, David. Michael has been dead for 20 years. Are you feeling all right?" I blinked repeatedly. Pressing a trembling hand to my forehead, I muttered a weak apology, claiming I had not slept well and was feeling a bit disoriented. Later that afternoon, when Monica stopped by to drop off some fabric swatches for Catherine, I executed the next phase of my performance. I casually opened the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water and silently placed my heavy set of car keys directly onto the middle shelf right next to the milk. I walked into the living room and began frantically searching my pockets, complaining loudly that I had lost my keys again. Monica immediately sprang into action, adopting the tone of a patronizing nurse. Within 3 minutes, she opened the refrigerator and gasped with manufactured shock. She pulled the keys out and held them up for David to see. I watched them from the corner of my eye. They were absolutely thrilled. I could see the barely contained glee dancing in Monica's eyes. I watched David subtly pull out his smartphone and type a quick note documenting my staged cognitive decline for their impending court filing. They were building their case completely unaware they were merely dancing on the stage I built for them. While I played the crumbling patriarch in the daylight, my nights were consumed by ruthless retaliation. I met with Thomas Bradley and my senior legal counsel in secure locations long after midnight. We moved with terrifying speed because the company was still legally entirely in my name, and the forged guarantor documents had not yet been activated by the offshore loan sharks. I had a narrow window to sever the diseased limbs of my empire. I quietly liquidated my massive personal stock portfolios, moving the capital into secure, blind trusts, completely insulated from Caldwell logistics and David's grasp. Next, we tackled the forged legal declarations. My attorneys worked directly with federal fraud investigators to place immediate holds on the fabricated guarantor documents David created. We built a firewall separating my personal identity from Beatrix's $2 million offshore debt. If the syndicates came looking for their money, they would hit an impenetrable wall. But my most devastating maneuver was structural. 30 years ago, I personally financed the construction of our primary distribution hub. The company still held a massive mortgage lien on that property, working silently. I executed a complex legal transfer, moving that massive lien out of the corporate holding company and directly into my own private trust. In one stroke, I transitioned from being the vulnerable founder to becoming the supreme, untouchable creditor of my own company. If David successfully seized the company through his fake conservatorship, he would inherit a staggering mountain of debt payable directly to me. By the end of the week, the trap was fully primed. I had successfully secured my personal wealth, completely neutralized his malicious leverage, and armed myself with enough forensic evidence to send him to federal prison for a decade. But I still needed one final, undeniable piece of physical evidence. I needed to catch him in the act of outright theft to destroy any potential defense he might try to mount in a courtroom. I needed to capture his true intent. On Thursday evening, I retreated to my home office. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and pulled out a stack of official gold-embossed corporate letterhead. I began drafting a document designed to be the ultimate irresistible bait. I titled it Immediate Transfer of CEO Powers. I filled the page with dense, highly authentic legal jargon outlining a total surrender of my position at Caldwell Logistics directly to David. I included clauses transferring total asset control and unmitigated banking authority. It was exactly what he and Monica were trying to achieve through their fraudulent court filing, but packaged as a voluntary gift. I printed the document and placed it precisely in the center of my leather desk pad. I laid my favorite gold fountain pen right beside it, leaving the signature line glaringly blank. I made sure the document looked like a work in progress, something I was contemplating but had not yet finalized. It was an incredibly dangerous piece of paper. To a desperate man, an unsigned transfer of power was an invitation to commit absolute forgery. I stood up and walked over to the tall bookshelf lining the far wall of the office. Hidden deep within the hollowed-out spine of an antique encyclopedia, I had installed a motion-activated micro camera. The lens was smaller than a pinhead, angled perfectly to capture the entire surface of my desk. I synced the live feed directly to my encrypted burner phone. I adjusted the lighting in the room to cast a soft, dramatic glow over the desk, ensuring the document was the focal point of the entire space. I walked out of the office, intentionally, leaving the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. I walked into the main kitchen where David was helping Catherine clean up after dinner. I yawned loudly, announcing that my mind was feeling exceptionally foggy and that I was going upstairs to take a long, deep sleep. I told them I left important paperwork on my desk and asked them not to disturb my office. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating with a steady rhythm. I closed my bedroom door and pulled out the burner phone. The screen flickered to life, showing the empty office and the blank signature line waiting in the dark. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the shadows stretch across my mahogany desk. The house was silent, but the air felt impossibly thick, suffocating me with the weight of my own son's betrayal. I turned toward the bed where Catherine lay awake, her eyes searching my face in the dim light. I walked over and gently grasped her hand. I told her to pack a small overnight bag quietly. I explained that we could not stay in this house tonight. David and Monica were still downstairs finishing their wine in the kitchen, pretending to be the perfect loving family. I could not sleep under the same roof as the people plotting to lock me away. We slipped out through the private side entrance attached to the master suite, leaving our home like fugitives in the night. A black sedan arranged earlier by Thomas Bradley was waiting for us at the end of the street. It transported us directly to a secure private suite in a downtown hotel far away from the toxic deception filling our own living room. The hotel room was immaculate and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home we had just abandoned. I connected my laptop to the secure network Thomas had established, transferring the live video feed from my burner phone to the larger high-define monitor. Catherine sat beside me on the edge of the stiff mattress, wrapping a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders. We sat together in the sterile darkness of the hotel suite, our eyes glued to the digital window, looking directly into my corporate sanctuary. For over an hour, the screen showed absolutely nothing but the quiet stillness of my empty office. The gold fountain pen gleamed faintly under the ambient streetlight, filtering through the large windows. The trap was perfectly laid, completely undisturbed. Catherine leaned her head against my shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. She wanted to believe that David would not cross the final line. She desperately wanted to believe that the boy she had carried, nurtured, and loved unconditionally would simply walk past the office door and go to sleep. But I knew the intoxicating pull of desperation. David was drowning in his mother-in-law's massive syndicate debt, and the document resting on that desk was his ultimate salvation. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, the heavy wooden door to my office slowly creaked open. Catherine gasped softly, her fingers digging painfully into my forearm. Two dark silhouettes stepped into the room. David reached out and flicked on the small brass reading lamp positioned on the edge of the bookshelf. The dim, warm light illuminated his face, revealing a mask of absolute predatory focus. Monica followed closely behind him, her movements quick and quiet. They did not look like a married couple checking on an elderly father. They moved with the synchronized, calculated precision of burglars breaking into a vault. David immediately bypassed the filing cabinets and walked directly toward my desk. His eyes locked onto the solitary piece of gold-embossed paper resting in the center of the leather pad. He leaned over, resting his hands flat on the desk, his eyes scanning the dense legal text I had painstakingly drafted just hours before. I watched his chest rise and fall rapidly as he absorbed the magnitude of the document. He picked it up, holding the paper closer to the brass lamp to read the specific clauses outlining the immediate voluntary transfer of my chief executive officer powers and total banking authority. A slow, sickening smile spread across his face, completely transforming his features into something unrecognizable. He turned to Monica, holding the document up like a victorious trophy. "Look at this," David whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and sheer exhilaration. "He actually drafted it. The old fool is practically handing over the keys to the entire kingdom on a silver platter. He is so completely terrified of his own declining memory that he is voluntarily drafting the exact surrender we needed." Monica stepped closer, snatching the paper from his hand. She read the clauses rapidly, her eyes darting back and forth across the page. Her lips parted into a wide, malicious grin. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed through the quiet office, a sound devoid of any human empathy. "I cannot believe this is actually happening," Monica sneered, tossing the document back onto the desk with an arrogant flick of her wrist. "He is making it so incredibly easy for us. I honestly thought we were going to have to fight him in court for months. But look at him. David. He is completely broken. He really is nothing but a senile cash cow waiting to be milked." The sheer venom in her voice was physically repulsive. Catherine began to weep silently beside me, the tears streaming down her face as she listened to the woman she had welcomed into our family mock my very existence. But the horror was far from over. David picked up the gold fountain pen, rolling it smoothly between his fingers. He stared down at the blank signature line waiting at the bottom of the page. "We do not even need to forge it right now," David said, his tone chillingly calm and entirely devoid of morality. "We will let him think it is his own brilliant idea. I will casually bring it up during family dinner on Friday night. I will play the concerned son telling him how exhausted he looks, how much he needs to step down for his own health. We will place this exact document in front of him, and he will sign it willingly to save face." He placed the pen back onto the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the paper. "And once he signs this on Friday, our problems are completely solved." David continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register that chilled me to the bone. "We secure the remaining pension funds, we satisfy the syndicate, and we quietly finalize the emergency medical conservatorship paperwork on Monday morning. We lock him in that specialized psychiatric facility in Nevada by the end of the month. It is isolated, highly secure, and strictly controls all external communications. He will never speak to a lawyer or a bank manager ever again. Beatrice will be absolutely safe. Our debts will be entirely erased, and we will finally have the total control we deserve." Catherine broke down into heavy, uncontrollable sus. The devastation of hearing her son calculate our permanent imprisonment shattered her heart. She buried her face into my shoulder, shaking violently as the reality of their greed washed over her. I did not offer any words of comfort. I simply wrapped my arm around her trembling frame and held her hand tightly. My eyes remained fixed on the glowing monitor, watching the two miserable rats scurrying happily through the maze I had meticulously designed for them. The paternal love that had once blinded me to their true nature evaporated, replaced by a dark, frozen resolve. "Let them have their Friday dinner," I whispered. "It will be their last." Friday evening arrived with an oppressive heat that mirrored the heavy tension settling deep within my chest. Catherine and I drove up the winding driveway of the Kensington estate just as the sun began to dip below the treine. The wrought iron gates were flanked by private valets, and the circular courtyard was packed with high-end luxury vehicles. Beatrice had not just planned an intimate family dinner to execute their coup, she had invited an audience. She had gathered her circle of wealthy, superficial acquaintances to witness her magnificent new lifestyle, funded entirely by my stolen pension reserves. I parked near the edge of the fountain, taking a brief moment to reach across the console and squeeze Catherine's hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly, but her eyes were filled with quiet strength. We had spent the last 48 hours grieving the son we thought we knew. Tonight, we were simply walking into a cage of predators, fully prepared to lock the door behind us. We walked up the stone steps and were ushered inside by a hired butler. The main living room had been completely transformed into a lavish cocktail reception. A string quartet played softly in the corner, drowned out by the shrill laughter of Beatrice holding court in the center of the room. She was draped in heavy silk and wearing a necklace of emeralds, holding a crystal flute of champagne, while she regaled guests with fabricated stories about her real estate investments. David stood slightly behind her, looking out of place despite his tailored suit. His face was pale, glistening with a thin sheen of nervous sweat. He was clutching a thick black leather folder tightly against his chest, his knuckles practically white from the pressure. He looked like a cornered animal, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When he noticed Catherine and me standing in the foyer, his posture instantly stiffened. Monica rushed over to greet us, her face plastered with a wide, insincere smile that did absolutely nothing to hide the malicious calculation in her eyes. She leaned in to kiss Catherine on the cheek, her perfume smelling sharp and overwhelming. "Richard, Catherine, we are so incredibly thrilled you could make it tonight." Monica chirped, her voice intentionally loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "We know how difficult it is for you to get out of the house these days, Richard, especially with your energy levels being so unpredictable lately." I leaned heavily on my walking cane, a new prop I had purchased specifically for this performance. I let my hand shake visibly as I reached out to pat Monica's arm, widening my eyes into an expression of absolute vacant confusion. "Thank you, dear," I rasped, making my voice sound thin and fragile. "I am just happy I remembered the way here. My mind has been playing terrible tricks on me all week. I keep misplacing my reading glasses and forgetting my own appointments." David let out a long, slow breath, visibly relaxing his shoulders as he watched my pathetic display of manufactured docility. The sight of my trembling hand entirely validated his criminal assumptions. He believed his trap was perfectly aligned. He walked over and guided me toward a velvet armchair in the corner of the room, treating me with the patronizing caution reserved for a brittle antique. He placed the black leather folder down on the side table next to me, his fingers lingering over the smooth cover. I knew exactly what was inside that folder. It was the bait I had left on my desk, the forged transfer of absolute corporate power waiting for my blind signature. David tapped the leather cover nervously, his eyes darting toward the dining room. "Just sit here and rest." "Dad," David said, his tone thick with condescension. "We will be moving into the formal dining room shortly. I have some important family business I want to discuss with you after the main course, something that will make your life much easier." I nodded blankly, sinking deep into the velvet cushions. I watched as the evening slowly devolved into a grotesque display of arrogance. Beatrice paraded her wealthy friends around the estate, bragging loudly about the custom renovations and the imported Italian marbles she had personally selected. Catherine stood quietly near the perimeter of the room, trying to remain invisible, but Beatrice was unwilling to let her peacefully exist. Beatrice snapped her fingers at a passing caterer, but the young man did not hear her over the music. Frustrated, Beatrice turned her piercing gaze directly onto my wife. "Catherine, darling," Beatrice called out, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the room. "Since you are just standing there doing absolutely nothing, be a dear and pass these crab appetizers around to the guests. The hired help is completely incompetent tonight, and you are so naturally accustomed to serving people in that quaint little kitchen of yours." The utter disrespect was breathtaking. The wealthy guests paused their conversations, watching to see how my wife would react to being publicly ordered around like a common servant in front of a crowd. Catherine's face flushed a deep crimson, but she maintained her absolute dignity. She did not argue. She simply picked up the silver tray and began walking silently among the guests, offering them the hors d'oeuvres. Monica watched this degrading spectacle with a smirk, whispering something into the ear of a woman standing next to her. I gripped the armrests of my chair, forcing myself to remain seated. The rage was building, pressing against my ribs, but the timing was not right. I had to wait for the main event. Eventually, the string quartet stopped playing and Beatrice loudly announced that dinner was served. We all moved into the massive formal dining room, taking our places around a long mahogany table, illuminated by a dripping crystal chandelier. The table was set with heavy silver and fine china. David sat directly across from me, the black leather folder, now resting ominously beside his dinner plate. He could not stop touching it. As the first course was served, I continued my performance, intentionally rattling my silverware against the porcelain plate and spilling a few drops of water onto the pristine white tablecloth. David watched my trembling hands with barely disguised glee. He was mentally counting down the minutes until he could slide that pen into my fingers. Beatrice, emboldened by her captive audience and her perceived total dominance, decided to escalate her cruelty. She leaned over her plate, pointing her wine glass directly at Catherine. "I must say, Catherine, you managed not to drop a single appetizer," Beatrice declared, her voice echoing loudly across the silent table. "You really do make an exceptional low-class maid. Perhaps I will hire you permanently once Richard is finally locked away." I stopped chewing my food. I placed my heavy silver fork down onto the polished dining table with a slow, highly deliberate movement. I completely stopped trembling. I slowly lifted my chin, looking directly into Beatrix's arrogant eyes with absolute terrifying clarity. The entire room went instantly, completely quiet. The heavy atmosphere turned instantly, absolutely freezing. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you have spent 4 decades building a commercial empire from the ground up, navigating treacherous boardroom negotiations, you learn exactly how to command a room without shouting. I looked directly at Beatrix, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out until the palpable discomfort in the room became almost a physical weight pressing against the guests. "My wife," I said, my voice resonating with a deep, unwavering authority that completely shattered the fragile, senile persona I had been meticulously portraying all evening, "is the foundation of everything you see around you. She built a life of actual substance and loyalty, while you spent your entire existence accumulating dangerous debts and empty vanity. Do not ever speak to her in that manner again. You are not a reigning queen holding court in a medieval palace. Beatrice, you are merely a guest at this table, and you will show the proper respect to the woman who actually knows the profound meaning of hard work. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, slicing through the manufactured elegance of the dinner party. Catherine stood near the edge of the dining room, her posture straightening as she looked at me with a mixture of surprise and profound relief. The shock on Beatrix's face was instantaneous and profound, her jaw practically unhinged. She looked around the long mahogany table at her wealthy friends, her curated audience, and saw their eyes wide with scandalized fascination. The grand illusion of her supreme dominance had just been publicly, effortlessly shattered by the man she considered a mindless, disposable relic. Her initial shock rapidly boiled over into pure, unadulterated fury, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of ugly aristocratic outrage. She stood up so quickly that her heavy mahogany dining chair tipped backward, crashing onto the imported Persian rug. "How dare you!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice losing all its manufactured elegance and dropping into a shrill grating pitch that echoed painfully off the high ceilings. She grabbed her delicate crystal wine glass and hurled it violently onto the polished hardwood floor. The exquisite crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, splashing expensive vintage red wine across the pristine baseboards like a spray of fresh blood. The dark liquid seeped into the grout, leaving a permanent stain. Several guests gasped, audibly, shrinking back in their plush seats, exchanging horrified, uncomfortable glances with one another. Monica let out a sharp theatrical cry of alarm, rushing to her mother's side and wrapping a comforting arm around her trembling shoulders, glaring at me as if I had committed a physical assault. "You insolent, ungrateful old fool!" Beatrice screamed, pointing a trembling diamond-encrusted finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. "You come into my beautiful home. You eat my expensive food, and you dare to speak to me with such flagrant, unacceptable disrespect. I will not tolerate this. I absolutely will not stand for this unbelievable indignity in front of my closest, most esteemed friends." She whipped her head around to face David, her eyes blazing with an irrational, demanding fury that bat no argument. "David, do something immediately. Handle your incredibly disrespectful father right now, or I swear I will have the private security team throw him out onto the street. He is completely out of control. He has ruined my entire beautiful evening with his insane delusions." David was already on his feet, his face flushed with a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The cold panic that had been simmering beneath his surface all evening was now fully exposed. His meticulously crafted plan was unraveling in real time, and he was absolutely terrified of losing his grip on the carefully constructed narrative. He needed me to remain the docile, confused victim, and my sudden display of sharp, articulated defiance threatened to expose his entire criminal framework to the very people he sought to impress. He marched around the edge of the expansive dining table, closing the physical distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. The superficial, charming facade he wore had completely vanished, replaced by desperate cruelty. He stopped just inches away from where I remained seated, towering over me in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reassert his waning dominance. He raised his hand and pointed his index finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with exertion. "What is wrong with you?" David hissed his voice, a harsh, venomous whisper meant to intimidate me back into immediate submission. "You are embarrassing Monica's mother in front of half the city's elite. You are having a severe mental episode. Dad, you are completely confused and you are making a massive scene. You need to apologize to her right now. Do you hear me? Apologize to her this very instant, or I swear to God I am putting you in a permanent medical home tomorrow morning. You clearly cannot function in polite society anymore without causing a disaster." He was playing his final desperate card. He was weaponizing the imminent threat of the conservatorship, using the terrifying fear of institutionalization to force my total compliance. He truly thought the mere mention of a locked nursing home would break my remaining spirit, that I would immediately crumble into pathetic tears and beg for his mercy to avoid being permanently locked away from my own life. The entire formal dining room went dead silent. The hired string quartet had long since stopped playing. The professional caterers froze in the arched doorways, holding their polished silver trays perfectly still like marble statues. The wealthy guests held their collective breath, their eyes darting nervously between David's furious flushed face and my own unwavering icy stare. They were witnessing a brutal, intimate family execution, and no one dared to intervene or speak a single word. Catherine remained standing tall near the edge of the room, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, invincible strength that gave me all the power I needed. David, mistaking my stillness for submission, turned swiftly to the side table. He snatched the heavy black leather folder he had been carefully guarding all evening. He ripped it open with unnecessary violent force, pulling out the gold-embossed document I had drafted in my home office. It was the absolute, irrevocable surrender of my corporate authority. He grabbed the gold fountain pen I had thoughtfully provided alongside it and marched back to my velvet chair. He slammed the crisp document down onto the table directly in front of me, shoving the heavy paper so hard it crumpled slightly against my chest. He pressed the cold metal of the gold pen into my hand, his grip tight and unforgiving. The silence in the room was absolute, pregnant with the heavy weight of impending destruction. The cold air conditioning hummed faintly in the background. David leaned down, placing his face just inches from mine. His eyes were wide, desperate, and filled with a terrifying absolute greed. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every single syllable with cold, calculated menace, fully convinced that he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner from which I could never return. Sign this and apologize. Now. I did not flinch. I looked down at the gold fountain pen resting on the forged document. I slowly reached out and picked it up. The metal felt cool against my skin. David leaned in closer, his eyes wide with victorious anticipation, fully believing his campaign of psychological terror had broken my spirit. He thought I was finally surrendering. Instead, I gripped the ends of the pen with both hands. I applied a sharp pressure, bending the metal until the thick gold barrel snapped in half with a loud crack. A pool of black ink instantly burst from the ruptured cartridge, spilling across the desk and bleeding into the paper. I opened my hands and let the jagged pieces clatter onto the ruined document. I looked dead into my son's terrified eyes. The silence in the dining room was absolute heavy with the suffocating weight of my sudden defiance. "You are fired," I said. The 3 words cut through the freezing air. David froze completely. The arrogant sneer on his face dissolved, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer confusion. He blinked rapidly, stepping back from the table as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another pathetic tirade about my mental state. But I did not give him the opportunity to utter a single syllable. I slowly turned my head and looked toward the arched doorway leading to the foyer. I gave a deliberate nod. The heavy doors swung open with a thud. Thomas Bradley quietly walked into the dining room, his face an emotionless mask of clinical precision. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 broad-shouldered individuals wearing dark suits and carrying the undeniable presence of federal agents. Their badges gleamed faintly under the crystal chandelier. The gas from the wealthy guests was instantaneous. The manufactured elegance of Beatrix's lavish dinner party evaporated, replaced immediately by the cold reality of a federal raid. David stumbled backward, his knees hitting a chair. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost. He looked from Thomas to the federal agents and finally back to me, his eyes wide with inescapable horror. He realized in that exact moment that the senile old man he thought he was hunting had actually been hunting him the entire time. I placed my hands flat against the heavy oak table and pushed myself up. Standing tall and steady, I ignored the walking cane entirely. I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with the wealthy, superficial acquaintances Beatrice had invited to witness her grand illusion. "My son." I began, my voice projecting clearly across the room. has spent the last several months convincing everyone here that my mental faculties are rapidly declining. He has painted a deeply convenient portrait of an aging patriarch losing his grip on reality. But the truth is far more sinister. David is not a concerned son. He is a desperate, cornered criminal. David raised a trembling hand, his voice a weak, pathetic squeak. Dad, please. You do not know what you are saying. I know exactly what I am saying. I commanded, silencing him instantly. I know now about the hollow shell company registered in Delaware. I know about the fraudulent $30,000 monthly consulting fees being routed to the Grand Cayman Royal Bank. I know about your desperate wire transfers to Sunround Casino Group, Horizon Island Betting, and the private debt consolidation firm in Macau. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching the heavy emerald necklace as if it were strangling her. The color vanished from her cheeks. The wealthy guests around her began to shift uncomfortably, pulling away from her chair. Beatrice does not own this magnificent new lifestyle. I continued, turning my freezing gaze directly onto the trembling woman. She owes a dangerous international syndicate of loan sharks over $2 million. She is drowning in compounding interest and gambling debts. And to keep those violent creditors away, my son decided to cross the ultimate unforgivable line. I looked back at David. He was shaking visibly in terror, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He did not just skim cash from the corporate operating accounts. I announced, ensuring every guest heard the absolute depth of his depravity. David secretly bypassed the security protocols and systematically drained over $4 million directly from the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. He stole the retirement savings of hardworking men and women to finance his mother-in-law's pathetic gambling addiction. A wave of shocked, disgusted murmurs rippled through the vast room. Monica buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The carefully curated illusion of their perfect superior life was being violently torn apart in front of the exact people they sought to impress. But David is also a profound coward. I stated, my voice echoing with righteous fury. He knew stealing federal pension funds would inevitably attract the authorities, so he needed a guarantee that he would walk away completely clean. He used my digital signature to forge legally binding documents, naming me as the personal guarantor of Beatrix's massive syndicate debts. He forged executive orders authorizing the creation of the phantom subsidiaries. He intentionally built an entire criminal enterprise designed to frame his own father for a massive federal crime. The federal agents stepped further into the room, their presence casting a very heavy, suffocating shadow over David and Beatrice. And when he realized the annual external audit was only 3 weeks away, I concluded he decided to spring his final trap. He and Monica drafted an emergency medical conservatorship petition. They planned to file it in a closed session next week, claiming I was suffering from severe dementia. They were going to lock me away in an isolated psychiatric facility in Nevada, silencing me permanently so they could assume total control of the company and cover their tracks. David fell to his knees. He collapsed onto the Persian rug, weeping loudly, burying his face in his hands. The arrogant executive was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified child, facing the devastating consequences of his own monumental greed. Beatrice, however, was not willing to surrender. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape. She pushed her heavy chair backward and bolted toward the arched doorway, leading to the grand foyer. She moved with frantic, desperate speed, her silk dress rustling loudly against the polished floor. But she did not make it far. The 2 federal agents moved with swift tactical precision, stepping directly into her path and blocking the doorway completely. Beatrice slammed into them, letting out a sharp, frustrated cry before stumbling backward. Realizing there was absolutely nowhere left to run, the trap was completely sealed. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I slowly withdrew a thick, folded legal document distinct from the ink-stained forgery currently ruined on the dining table. I held the crisp white paper up, letting the ambient light catch the official notary seals stamped across the bottom edge. Oh, And one more thing about this house, I said. I unfolded the crisp white document, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. David watched the paper with terrified eyes, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the rapid destruction of his entire world. Monica stopped sobbing, her gaze fixed on the official legal seals stamped across the bottom of the page. Even Beatrice had gone completely still, her desperate attempt to flee completely thwarted by the two federal agents firmly blocking the arched doorway. When Catherine and I provided the $1.22 million for the down payment on this magnificent estate, I began my voice perfectly level and devoid of paternal warmth. You both operated under the convenient assumption that it was a simple, unconditional gift from a loving father to his successful son. You treated it as an inheritance delivered early. You paraded around this mansion, bragging to your wealthy friends about your real estate acumen. Convinced my money was simply your fundamental right, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, bringing myself closer to where David remained, kneeling on the Persian rug. But I did not write a personal check. David, if you had bothered to actually read the financial disclosure forms your lawyer sent over during the closing, you would have noticed the specific origin of those funds. The capital did not come from my personal savings. It came directly from the corporate treasury of Caldwell Logistics. Legally, it was structured and recorded as a secured corporate loan tethered to your continued employment within the company. David stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He finally understood the fatal error he had made. Since you have actively embezzled millions of dollars from the employee pension reserves, I continued projecting my voice so every guest could hear the finality of my words. Your employment at Caldwell Logistics is officially terminated, effective immediately, because you are now terminated for gross financial misconduct. That corporate loan is instantly in a state of catastrophic default. I am not simply seizing your assets. I am executing an immediate, irrevocable foreclosure on this property. I dropped the heavy legal document directly onto the polished mahogany dining table, right next to the shattered pieces of my gold fountain pen. This is a formal notice of immediate eviction. I declared, you do not own this house anymore. The bank does not own this house. Caldwell Logistics owns every single brick, every piece of imported marble, and every square inch of this manicured lawn. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever belongings you can carry and vacate the premises completely. If you are still inside by tomorrow evening, I will have the private security team physically drag you out onto the street. Monica let out a sharp, piercing shriek. She spun around to face David, her hands curling into tight fists. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered just as quickly as their financial security. You promised me we were safe? Monica screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. You swore to me that your father was too stupid to figure out the transfers. You told me the pension money was untraceable. You ruined everything. You completely ruined my entire life before David could formulate a pathetic excuse. Monica raised her hand and struck him across the face. The slap echoed through the silent dining room like a gunshot. David recoiled, pressing a trembling hand to his reeling cheek. But Monica was not finished. She stood over him, her voice dripping with venom. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this house. She spat, her tone entirely devoid of residual affection. I am not going to federal prison because you were incompetent. You are completely on your own. David, do not ever speak to me again. She turned on her heel and marched toward the front door, pushing violently past the stunned guests who quickly scrambled out of her way. She did not look back. As Monica stormed out of the mansion, the two federal agents stepped forward, closing the circle around Beatrice. The matriarch shrank back against the wall, her aristocratic arrogance completely replaced by raw panic. She clutched her diamond necklace, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. You cannot do this to me. Beatrice stammered, looking frantically between the agents and my unyielding face. I am a respected member of this community. I serve on 5 charity boards. You cannot arrest me in my own home. I have powerful lawyers. I will sue you for this unbelievable indignity. The lead federal agent reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. They clinked together with a sharp, terrifying sound. "Beatrice Kensington," the agent said, his voice deep and authoritative. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud a federal pension fund. You have the right to remain silent." Beatrice let out a hysterical scream. She thrashed wildly as the agent stepped forward, grabbing her arms and twisting them forcefully behind her back. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. She kicked her designer shoes against the floor, weeping loudly and begging her wealthy friends for help. But the guests simply stared at her in horrified silence. No one stepped forward to defend a woman exposed as a desperate criminal. The agents practically dragged her out of the dining room, her shrill cries echoing down the long hallway until the front door slammed shut, severing her completely from the life she had stolen. David remained kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his entire existence. He had lost his wife, his home, his career, and his freedom. In a matter of minutes, he looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his eyes red and swollen with absolute despair. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out to grasp the hem of my trousers. "Dad, please," David begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Please stop this. I am your son. You cannot just leave me here with nothing. You cannot let them send me to a federal prison. I will do anything you want. I will confess to everything. Just please forgive me. Please do not walk away from me." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature groveling at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. The son I had loved and protected for 40 years was already dead, replaced long ago by this greedy, soulless parasite. I slowly reached down and pulled my trousers free from his trembling grasp. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply turned away from him forever. I walked over to Catherine. She was standing near the arched doorway, radiating a quiet, invincible strength. I gently placed my hand on her arm, offering her a soft, reassuring smile. We walked together toward the exit, our footsteps echoing loudly through the silent, cavernous mansion. I did not look back at David. I simply stepped over the shattered glass of Beatrix's ruined wine, leaving the wreckage of their lives entirely behind us as we walked into the cool, peaceful, dark night air. The drive back to our hotel that night was enveloped in a profound and heavy silence. Catherine held my right hand tightly resting on the center console of the car. Neither of us spoke a single word. We did not need to. The colossal weight that had been pressing down on our chests for the past week had finally been lifted. We had walked into a den of vipers and dismantled their entire treacherous ecosystem with absolute precision. But as we rode through the quiet, dark streets of the city, I knew the battle was not entirely over. The surgical extraction of the cancer was complete, but the grueling process of cleaning up the infected wounds was just about to begin. I had to secure the future of the innocent people caught in the crossfire of my son's monumental greed. By Monday morning, the fallout was absolute and spectacular. The federal raid on the Kensington estate was simply too massive to keep quiet. Local newspapers, financial blogs, and morning news broadcasts seized upon the story with relentless hunger. The headlines were brutal and unforgiving. They detailed the spectacular collapse of a prominent local executive, exposing the web of forged documents, illicit offshore wire transfers, and the despicable theft of employee retirement funds. David's carefully curated reputation was instantly and permanently obliterated. The elite business community that had once eagerly accepted his lavish dinners and expensive gifts immediately turned their backs on him. His name became toxic overnight. Corporate partners canceled pending contracts. Former friends stopped answering his frantic phone calls, and his prestigious country club quietly revoked his membership by the end of the day. The justice system moved with a swift, merciless efficiency that offered no comfort to the wicked. Beatrice faced her initial arraignment hearing on Tuesday afternoon. She stood before a federal judge wearing a drab-issued uniform, a stark contrast to the heavy silks and imported emeralds she had flaunted just days earlier. Her high-priced defense attorneys argued passionately for her release, citing her age and her supposed standing in the philanthropic community, but the federal prosecutors presented a mountain of irrefutable evidence provided by Thomas Bradley. They detailed her deep ongoing connections to violent international syndicates and highlighted the extreme flight risk she posed. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. Beatrice was denied bail entirely. She was remanded to federal custody, forced to sit in a cold, concrete cell to await a trial that would inevitably strip away the remaining years of her life. Monica, true to her cold and calculating nature, did not waste a single moment mourning the catastrophic implosion of her family. The second she walked out of the mansion on that fateful Friday night, she initiated her exit strategy. By Wednesday morning, her aggressive legal team filed emergency divorce papers against David. She ruthlessly petitioned for sole ownership of any remaining untainted assets, desperately attempting to secure whatever meager financial scraps had not yet been frozen by federal investigators. She publicly disavowed any knowledge of her husband's criminal enterprise or her mother's staggering gambling debts. She abandoned David completely, leaving him entirely alone to face the devastating consequences of the crimes he had committed in the name of securing her luxurious lifestyle. They had built their marriage on a foundation of mutual greed, and when the money evaporated, their loyalty vanished instantly into the thin air. While my former family tore themselves apart in the public eye, I directed my entire focus toward the innocent victims of this disaster. I returned to the primary headquarters of Caldwell Logistics on Thursday morning. The atmosphere in the building was thick with palpable fear and uncertainty. The employees had seen the news reports. They knew their pension funds had been raided. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, wondering if their decades of hard work had simply vanished into the pockets of offshore criminals. I called an emergency meeting in the main warehouse, gathering every single worker manager and administrative assistant on the payroll. I stood before them on a wooden shipping pallet, looking out at the sea of anxious faces. I did not offer them corporate platitudes or hollow promises. I spoke to them with absolute transparent honesty. I confirmed the horrifying truth that my son had systematically embezzled over $4 million from their dedicated retirement reserves. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a heavy, despairing silence. Then I told them the rest of the story. I explained that I had personally liquidated my massive private stock portfolios and transferred the company's primary mortgage lien directly into my secure personal trust. I looked directly at the men and women who had dedicated their lives to building my company. I told them that their futures were not tied to the failures of my son. I announced that I was using my own personal secured wealth to completely and instantly refund every single dollar that had been drained from the pension accounts. The money was already wired, the accounts were fully restored, and their retirements were absolutely safe. Furthermore, I pledged a personal guarantee to match their upcoming quarterly contributions as a gesture of profound apology for the stress my family had brought to their doorsteps. The reaction was overwhelming. The heavy silence broke, replaced by a wave of profound, tearful relief. Men and women who had worked the loading docks for 20 years approached me with tears streaming down their weathered faces, shaking my hand and expressing an emotional gratitude that humbled me to my core. I had walked into that warehouse as a man broken by the ultimate betrayal of his own flesh and blood. But I walked out surrounded by the unbreakable, undying loyalty of my true family, the people who actually understood the meaning of hard work, dedication, and mutual respect. Catherine and I spent the next few weeks quietly dismantling the remnants of our old life. We had no desire to return to the sprawling, empty estate that David had tainted with his greed. We sold the large house and purchased a small, modest single-story home on the quiet outskirts of the city. It had a wraparound porch, a small garden for Catherine, and a sense of absolute peace that we had not felt in years. We settled into a quiet, comforting routine, slowly healing the deep emotional wounds inflicted by the people we had once trusted most. It was a Tuesday night in late November, when the fragile peace was suddenly shattered. A violent, unseasonal thunderstorm had rolled into the valley just after dinner. The wind howled fiercely through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding our modest property, and heavy sheets of freezing rain battered against the window panes with aggressive force. Catherine and I had gone to bed early, exhausted by the damp chill in the air. We were wrapped warmly in heavy blankets, the rhythmic drumming of the storm lulling us into a deep sleep. Then, exactly at the stroke of midnight, the loud, jarring chime of the front doorbell echoed sharply through the silent house. I sat up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital clock glowed green, displaying exactly midnight. Beside me, Catherine stirred her hand, reaching out to grasp my arm. The violent storm outside was raging with terrifying intensity. The relentless wind lashed freezing rain against the siding of our modest home, but the frantic, continuous ringing of the front doorbell pierced sharply through the cacophony of the weather. No one arrives at a secluded house in a torrential downpour at midnight, bearing good news. I threw off the wool blankets and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. I slid my bare feet into my slippers and wrapped a flannel robe tightly around my shoulders, tying the belt with precision. Catherine sat up against the headboard, her eyes wide with sudden fear. I raised a calm hand, silently signaling for her to remain within the bedroom. I walked slowly down the dark hallway, the wooden floorboards cold beneath my feet. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, accompanied by the desperate, muffled sound of a fist pounding frantically against the solid oak door. I reached the small entryway and flipped the switch for the porch light. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out, gripping the brass deadbolt and turning the latch. I pulled the heavy door open, bracing myself against the sudden rush of freezing wind. Standing on my concrete porch, illuminated by the flickering yellow glow of the overhead security light, was my son. David was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, impeccably groomed corporate executive who had tried to destroy my life just weeks earlier. He was soaked entirely to the bone. His custom-tailored designer suit was completely ruined, plastered to his violently shivering frame like a second skin stained with dark mud and urban filth. He wore no protective overcoat, and the freezing rain dripped continuously from his matted, unkempt hair down into his hollow, bloodshot eyes. He looked as though he had aged 10 harsh years in the span of a single month. His face was grotesquely gaunt, the pale skin stretched tightly over his prominent cheekbones, bruised by the brutal reality of his new existence. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard they made a rhythmic clicking sound against the deafening roar of the raging storm. He had absolutely nothing left in his possession. He carried no luggage, no bag, not even a cellular phone in his trembling, dirt-stained hands. He was a broken, desperate creature who had been entirely chewed up and spat out by the very same harsh reality he had so arrogantly tried to manipulate. I stood silently in the doorway, physically blocking the entrance, my expression a completely unreadable mask of absolute detachment. I did not step aside to invite him into the comforting warmth of my hallway. I did not offer him a dry towel or a cup of hot coffee. I simply looked down at him, letting the freezing cold reality of his pathetic presence settle heavily between us. David looked up at me, his wide eyes brimming with an agonizing mixture of absolute terror and profound desperation. He opened his mouth to speak, but initially only a ragged, choking sob escaped his trembling lips. He fell heavily to his knees on the wet concrete planks of the porch, the freezing rain continuing to beat down relentlessly upon his hunched, defeated shoulders. He reached out with trembling, blue-tinged fingers, hovering his hands just inches from the hem of my flannel robe, clearly too terrified to actually make physical contact with me. "Dad!" David wept, his voice aoro, broken whisper barely audible over the howling, unforgiving wind. "Please, Dad, you have to help me. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I have walked for miles through the city in the freezing rain. I have absolutely nothing left." I remained perfectly still, a silent, immovable sentinel, guarding the hard one piece of my new life. I waited patiently for him to continue, knowing with absolute certainty that the true cowardly nature of his character would inevitably reveal itself, even in his absolute lowest moment of defeat. David sobbed much louder, wiping his wet, filthy face with the back of his shivering, bruised hand. "It was not my fault, Dad," he pleaded, his voice rising in a frantic pitch as he desperately tried to rewrite the damning narrative of his own spectacular destruction. "I swear to you, on my life, it was all Monica and Beatrice. They completely brainwashed me. They manipulated my emotions. Beatrice was drowning in those massive, dangerous syndicate gambling debts, and Monica threatened to leave me forever if I did not find a way to maintain our luxurious lifestyle. They pushed me into a corner. Dad, they made me forge those financial documents. They essentially forced me to take that employee pension money. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to save my failing marriage. I was terrified of losing everything I had built, and they completely poisoned my mind against you. They convinced me you were losing your memory. They made me believe the conservatorship was the only logical way to save the company from your declining health. It was their wicked plan from the very beginning." His frantic words were a cowardly attempt to deflect the undeniable weight of his criminal guilt. Even now, destroyed and kneeling in the freezing mud like a stray animal, he could not accept unconditional responsibility for his own breathtaking greed. He was still the exact same arrogant man who had planned to lock his own father away in a sterile, isolated psychiatric ward. He looked up at me again, his swollen eyes silently begging for a shred of the paternal weakness he had ruthlessly exploited for decades. "Monica took everything from me, Dad." David continued, his voice cracking with sickening self-pity. "Her ruthless divorce lawyers froze all my personal offshore accounts. The federal prosecutors have permanently seized whatever remaining assets I had left. My so-called prestigious friends will not even answer my desperate phone calls anymore. I am sleeping on the dangerous streets of this city. I am freezing cold, and I am so unbelievably hungry. Please, Dad. I am your only son. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot just leave me out here to die in the freezing storm. I am not asking to come inside the warm house. I am not asking for a soft bedroom or a hot home-cooked meal. I just need a dry, safe place to lie down for a few hours. Please, Dad, just let me sleep in the garage. Let me curl up in the corner on the cold concrete floor just for tonight so I do not freeze to death in this awful storm. I will leave first thing tomorrow morning before the sun even comes up. I swear to you that you will never even know I am there. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees for a second chance." I looked down at my shivering, weeping son, the ultimate agonizing test of my remaining resolve. I stared into the bloodshot eyes of the man kneeling on my wet concrete porch. The freezing rain continued to wash over him in heavy, relentless sheets, flattening his ruined, expensive hair against his skull. The cold wind howled around us, rattling the porch light, but the chill inside my chest was far more profound. This was the boy I had joyfully carried on my shoulders through summer parks. This was the young man I had proudly guided through his first tentative steps in the corporate world, handing him every possible advantage. But the weeping, desperate shell shivering before me now held absolutely no resemblance to a son. He was merely a predator, stripped of its dangerous fangs, begging for sanctuary from the very storm he had intentionally, meticulously created. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my voice would pierce through the deafening roar of the midnight tempest. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, devastating, absolute certainty that carried the heavy finality of a judge delivering a permanent, irrevocable sentence. "I gave you an empire," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones onto the wet porch. "I handed you a legacy of honor, a life of unimaginable privilege, and an open door to everything I had built with my bare hands. And in return, you tried to put me in a cage. You conspired to lock me away in the dark, to erase my entire existence simply so you could comfortably feed your endless, pathetic greed." David let out a loud, wretched wail, dropping his head until his forehead nearly touched my slippers. He reached out again, his fingers scraping desperately against the concrete. "Dad, please, I am begging you, he sobbed. You are not my son anymore. I continued, cutting off his pathetic pleas with absolute unyielding finality. You are simply a consequence of your own greed, and consequences must be faced alone. I stepped backward into the dry warmth of my entryway. David lunged forward, his hands slapping loudly against the wooden threshold, but I was already moving. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door. I looked at him one final time, watching the horrifying realization wash over his pale, freezing face. I pulled the heavy door shut. The thick wood clicked securely into the frame, instantly silencing his desperate, muffled cries. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, hearing the solid metallic thud lock him out of my life forever. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long, reflective moment, listening to the muffled drumming of the rain against the glass. I realized that the man I had mourned did not die tonight. He had died many years ago, slowly replaced by a stranger, entirely consumed by his own vanity and blind ambition. I had finally accepted the profound truth. My breathing was slow and perfectly even. The crushing weight that had burdened my shoulders for the past 48 hours was completely gone. I untied the belt of my flannel robe, adjusted the collar, and turned away from the door. I walked slowly into the main living room. The small brick fireplace was glowing with a warm, comforting amber light. Catherine was sitting in her favorite armchair, a thick woven blanket draped elegantly across her lap. She looked up at me as I entered the room, her eyes searching my face for any lingering signs of regret, guilt, or hesitation. I simply smiled. I walked over and sat down beside her, reaching out to gently take her warm hand in mine. We sat together in the peaceful golden glow of the hearth, listening to the storm raging harmlessly outside our thick walls. We were finally safe. Our hard-won legacy was completely protected from the vultures who had tried to tear it apart, and our remaining years belonged entirely to us. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. As a parent, your natural instinct is to protect your children at all costs, to offer them the world on a silver platter. But blind generosity to an entitled heart only breeds monsters. Never let love blind you to disrespect, and never allow anyone, even your own flesh and blood, to treat you as collateral damage in their selfish games. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love and tough love combined is having the courage to close the door on those who only saw your worth in dollar signs. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Thank you for watching and supporting my channel today.